Welcome back to part 3 of our mini-series on analytical essay writing. So over the last 2 tutorials, we looked at the idea of what an analytical essay is, so how it serves as a summary of our process of analysis. And then we looked at what's involved in the skills of deconstructing a question. And the next step of the process is, having broken the question down and found a way to make it useful to you, we then actually have to brainstorm our answer. So in the last tutorial, I posed 2 questions. One that you had already seen in your handout from me, and which was one of the sample questions in 2020, a question about the concept of disorder. And then I posed a second question to you, which was number 17 from our practice question handout, that looked at the relationship between unnatural deeds and unnatural troubles. And so to demonstrate the process of brainstorming, I'm actually going to break down the unnatural deeds and unnatural troubles question using my process. So because I'm a visual learner, I really like to use a mind map as a way of demonstrating, working out for myself what connections I can actually see and what I'd like to explore in my essay. It's really important to note that there's no one way to analyze, there's no one way to brainstorm. It's really important that you find what works for you. It has to be efficient, it has to encourage new connections, and it has to be something that you feel confident controlling when the question is unseen and when you're working to a time limit. Okay, so let's have a look at the deconstruction of our question, and then we'll come back together and have a look at the thesis that I developed as a result of my brainstorming.
Okay, welcome back everybody. I always think it's important that we brainstorm kinesthetically, so using our hand to write out our notes, because the process of working kinesthetically to connect the ideas in your head to words on the page helps to actually generate new ideas. I think it's so valuable that we have to handwrite our essays, because we're actually encouraged to plan on paper, and I would urge you from now until the mock exam and from the mock exam to the external to plan on paper and to brainstorm on paper whenever you get the opportunity. This will actually help encourage your brain to make new connections rather than simply relisting ideas that you already have. So, using the question that I deconstructed in the previous tutorial, I'm going to demonstrate how I brainstorm. Now, there's no right or wrong way to brainstorm, and the most important thing to remember is that you need to find a technique that works for you. So, I'm a visual learner, so it makes sense to me to work graphically to get all the ideas out of my brain onto the page, and then to work out how I want to connect those ideas. For me, the most important thing from the brainstorming stage is that it's messy and unformed. You're not looking to list points in order yet. You're not looking to prioritise which argument is better. You're not looking to connect ideas to evidence just yet. At this stage, you're trying to get it out of your head and onto the page so that you can see what evaluation you'd like to offer. Now, one would assume, if you've had a choice of more than one question, that you've chosen this question because you already know that you have some knowledge about it. So, of course, we're not going to entirely ignore what we know, but we're going to work to try and form some new connections to see what sort of evaluation we can create. So this is a technique called mind mapping. I've been using it for my entire adult life, for everything I write, from lesson plans to essays. And it was something that was taught to me by a wonderful Year 7 teacher who happened to have been my mum, and I've been using it ever since. So this is something that I'm really used to using, I'm very confident using, and I know that it will work for me in no more than 5 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is brainstorm this particular question. You can see I've already deconstructed it using the 3 key components: directive, focalizer and scope. And I'm going to draw the focalizer in a box in the centre of my mind map, and then I'm going to go ahead and tease out some ways that I could explore this text. Now, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I'm putting the key concept in the centre because that's what everything should be connected to. but the arms that actually come off this could be of your own choosing. They're kind of linked to your scope though. I'm going to try and talk out what I'm doing while I'm doing it, but ultimately what I want you to see in my process is that it's actually reasonably unformed, and I kind of jump all over the place. I might change colours when I know I want to start highlighting key components, and you need to then see if this is something that might work for you, just to get those ideas out of your head and onto the page, particularly when you're nervous. Okay, here we go. So in the centre goes my destruction of natural order. And I mentioned that idea of the destruction of the order was what was so important. So that's what I've got to focus on. So I need to think of maybe some synonyms. Chaos. I really like the idea of dis-ease. I've liked the idea, as I've been talking to my class, of dysfunction. Ooh, dis-ease and dysfunction. Well, we're seeing dis-ease through the kingdom where a whole lot of unnatural events are occurring. We'll get to that soon. Dysfunction, well, that's certainly to do with Macbeth and his rule. So maybe I can explore that a bit more. So I know that Macbeth is a character, which means as characterization as a stylistic device, I can use a deconstruction of Macbeth specifically to explore this theme of the destruction of natural order. So let's have a look at Macbeth as a character. So he is supposed to be, he is our protagonist, and he's a villain. So villain protagonists, they're an interesting breed. We have to look at that together. So that means he's probably responsible for the destruction. Okay, so how did he become responsible? Why is he responsible? Well, he's responsible because he has a hamasha, a fatal flaw. And his fatal flaw, we know, is not just ambition, but selfish ambition, and a desire to win without the hard work. Okay? How else does it happen that he becomes responsible for the destruction of order? Well, he listens to some witches. Okay? Combining the idea that he's responsible because of something in him which was then legitimised by someone outside of him gives me something to play with as far as how this happens. But the question doesn't just ask me how does disorder start or destruction start. It asks me how it becomes one of the main themes. So I can't just think about one character. I've got to think about how else it might become one of the main things. Well, I would consider the imagery of blood, and specifically the imagery of blood associated with violence. Okay, so I've written the point there about violence and villainy. Now, the point I'd like to make here is that up until the first of the murders, blood is used as a reference to sovereignty, to brotherhood, to loyalty. And those are all associated with the concept of chivalry. So chivalry existed in Act 1, and then it returns in Act 5. Between Act 1 and Act 5, however, chivalry has been destroyed. So that means that we can associate chivalry with natural order and villainy with the destruction of natural order. So let's think about what is chivalrous. Generosity, bravery, courage, hospitality, loyalty, trustworthiness, so honesty. All of those are components of chivalry. So what do we see instead that destroys natural order? Well, instead we see violence, obviously, that's why we put it down there. We see dishonesty, so there's another one of our dis words. Dishonesty. We see a lack of hospitality. We kill the king in our home. I see a lack of courage. We kill a man's innocent family, his wife and children, rather than actually targeting him, as a way of trying to get him out of the battle. particularly want to do in this argument is connect it to the imagery of blood. Okay, so I'm going to explore this as a motif, and I really want to look at all the ways that blood is used. That means I'm going to have a couple of blood references. So I'm going to make a little note to myself to use some quotes. Okay, so I actually need quotes about blood. Who knew that the old man had so much blood in him? Out damn spot. Connections to blood. Connections to blood connected to destruction, so that I can actually explore the way that this theme becomes more prominent. So I've got characterization, I've got a motif that's being used to actually convey a big concept, the idea that chivalry has given way to villainy. What else could I do? Well, we've got up here the idea of unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. So troubles kind of accumulate in this particular place. That means I could explore the plot. And I'm going to put a little note to myself here about the accumulation of troubles. Right? The accumulation of troubles. Now, these aren't just any old troubles, they're unnatural. Now, what are the most unnatural troubles we have? The murders. Now, remember that word I used in part 2, significance? Well, this is when we can think about the significance of these particular murders. Macbeth, remember, is a soldier. He has killed people on the battlefield. In fact, part of what is celebrated in Act 1, Scene 1, or Act 1, Scene 2, is the fact that he cleft MacDonald in twain and then beheaded him. He unseamed him and then beheaded him. So this is a man familiar with death. But these are not natural deaths. These are not expected deaths. Unnatural deeds breed unnatural troubles. So we need to think about the idea of these murders being unnatural and therefore conveying this idea of villainy and therefore leading to the destruction of society. So it's a king, a friend who's basically introduced as a kinsman, so like a brother. King, kinsman, family. So these murders matter because they're showing the descent of Macbeth into disorder. All right, at this point, I normally take a break. I often change pen colour or I get out a highlighter and I will think about if there are particular words that I would like to emphasise. All right, so because we've got this idea of unnatural, I might just do a little bit of synonym work around unnatural. Now, unnatural could be alien. Well, the Malcolm and Donalbain are certainly alienated from their family by the fact that they are forced to flee to England and Ireland respectively. So it could be that it's alien. It is monstrous. The idea that something that is monstrous is probably there to offer a warning or to demonstrate what happens when. So if something has become monstrous, then it's probably as a result of these unnatural deeds. So that word's being used very specifically. Well, what else is unnatural? A fiend-like queen, certainly. A king being described as a butcher. But they're moving on to nouns there. We want to stay back on adjectives. So what else could we say is an adjective that's the same as unnatural? It could be mutated. Could be infected. It could be toxic. Right now, there are obviously natural toxins and there are unnatural toxins. But what we're playing with is the idea that this is not something we should be expecting to see. So we'll include that one too. Unexpected. All right, so analyse how the destruction of natural order becomes. So here is the important thing with the way we use cohesive ties when the question is specifically directing us to become more important. So now we have to see a pattern of cause and effect. We have to see if we can connect these arguments in such a way that we can say this leads to that. Okay, so we mentioned about the fact that we are introduced to Macbeth in Act 1 when chivalry still reigns. So it's going to be important that we establish that what happens in Act 1 that actually becomes a catalyst for Macbeth is the presentation of the witches and the presentation of his Hamasha. So if I was planning this out, I'd probably write a little 1 just near that, because that's going to happen first. But I'm also going to have to identify that Macbeth is a villain protagonist and that ultimately he is responsible. That's probably going to become something that's in my thesis. So I'm going to put a little T next to that. That idea has to be in my thesis. Well, if he's responsible for the downfall of society, how does he achieve it? Well, he achieves it, at least in part, through the accumulation of troubles that's specifically linked to violence and villainy. The impact of his Hamasha and the outside motivation of the witches is that he actually accumulates unnatural deeds in the form of murder, so 2, and these lead to the manipulation of the motif of blood, 3. So my next step then would normally be to take all of this brainstorming and to turn it into a working thesis that's just enough of a thesis to actually allow me to plan the whole essay. All right, let's jump back to our PowerPoint.
So that was a pretty detailed plan, and you would notice that I went into quite a lot of detail as far as trying to work out all the different ways I could explore the importance of that particular question and the importance of the themes that it was asking us to analyse. I always try to put lots of work into my planning, including, as you would have seen, breaking down some different synonyms for the main words in the question, as well as exploring a number of different stylistic devices. So in the analysis of the play, it would make sense that you would analyse characters and you would analyse plot, and that in the case of a play with such significant symbolism, that you would also play with the symbolism, particularly when it's relevant to the question. Okay, so as a result of my brainstorming then, I developed a thesis that I felt I could work with to actually go on and construct my plan. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so this thesis, I'm not remotely embarrassed to tell you, took me about 15 minutes to write. So as a result, it's not really a thesis 1.0. It's kind of like a thesis 1.5. It's got some evaluative elements. It's certainly got connections to stylistic devices, values, attitudes, and beliefs, but it's probably not quite perfect, and it certainly shouldn't be finished because I haven't actually planned my essay. But let's have a look at ultimately what I did with this question. So just to remind you of our question from tutorial 2. So there it is. Unnatural deeds do breed unnatural trouble. So from Act 5, Scene 1, analyse how the destruction of natural order becomes one of the main themes in Macbeth. So analyse how the destruction of natural order becomes one of the main themes in Macbeth. Okay, so I broke it down on the board, and this is the thesis that I felt I could work with, and that would allow me maybe to pull together those main ideas that I explored on the board in some kind of sequence. So I know I'm going to have to play with the order and the cohesion of my ideas, but this would work as a good umbrella statement and would help link all of those together. So let's have a look at it. The audience is cautioned to see the destruction of natural order throughout the kingdom as a consequence of the selfish actions of those in authority. So you might remember when I started planning on the board, I started with the idea of Macbeth as central to the theme of the destruction of natural order, because he's the one who destroys it. Why was he like that? Because of his own Hamasha. How did we get into this situation? Because the witches helped to legitimize the course of action that he might have taken anyway. And so ultimately the selfish actions of Macbeth drive everything else. So I've actually, the end of my statement there, end of my thesis is actually the first thing that I planned. And you can see that there are cohesive ties that actually connect that together. So the idea is the selfish actions of those in authority, is the consequence, or is the result of, is the cause of disorder throughout the whole of the kingdom. And we as an audience are cautioned to recognise that. And one would assume we're cautioned to recognise that so that we don't actually vote people in who might have the same effect. Or as we see the early stages happening, we can arrest their actions and we can actually make a change in our society. So this thesis includes some evaluative words. So that's words where I've made a judgment. And these are words where I could have put in a simpler word or a maybe more boring word and offered less in the way of a nuanced thesis. So because I've said the audience is cautioned, cautioned is a word that has some judgment attached to it. I could have just said the audience is positioned, and I would still be correct, the audience is positioned. But by cautioned, I'm just adding a little bit of detail there. And I'm suggesting that the audience isn't just put in the position to see, they're put in the position to see this as a warning. Okay, so that's a particular way of seeing. And so you could look at a whole lot of, in fact, I strongly recommend it, a whole lot of synonyms for positioned. And they should be verbs, and they should be verbs that let us see things in different ways. Okay, so action verbs and verbs to do with sight. So the audience is cautioned. There's the first of my evaluative terms, to see the destructive of natural order throughout the kingdom. So that's me offering some framework to my particular interpretation of this idea of the destruction of natural order. It's going to be throughout the kingdom. So that'll mean I'll be able to use evidence from anywhere in the play, because Macbeth's influence permeates throughout the whole of the society. So even when we talk about the horses eating each other, we can link that back to Macbeth because it's anywhere in the kingdom. As a result of the selfish actions. Okay, so I could have just left out that word selfish and just said the actions of those in authority. And that still would have been a correct statement. But by recognizing ultimately that the things that Macbeth decides to do, he does for his own interest, is part of what destroys society when you're the king. Because we have a responsibility when we're in positions of leadership to act on the behalf of others. So by choosing to act selfishly, he puts himself before the well-being of his kingdom, and things start to fall apart. And he makes some pretty questionable choices. So the way in which, the speed with which things fall apart is obviously as a direct result of the fact that he's actually murdering people. Okay, so after I have brainstormed in quite a bit of detail and I found some ways to connect my ideas and I've developed a thesis, I then go into my planning. And the key difference from brainstorming to planning is I should now start to see an order come together. So we have shared this graphic organizer with you. It's actually developed in response to the latest advice from QCAA around how QCAA would like you to organise your thinking when you're getting ready to write an essay. And it's designed to be deliberately simple. And that's mostly because you're going to have to produce it in the exam yourself. We're not going to hand you any kind of scaffold because we're not allowed to. And so this needs to be a document that you can make work. It's very simple in design so that you can just draw it freehand, or you can rule it up on your planning paper. And you will see that it has been designed so that the question ideas and then the thesis ideas span all three arguments. The organisation for the planning of each of the three arguments is exactly the same. You have to have this claim. So those are those big, brash statements we make that, you know, require defence if we're going to, if they're going to be allowed to stand. But at this stage, it's like a hypothesis. We can't prove it, or we haven't proved it. So it is an unsubstantiated claim. Because our claim will quite possibly involve reference to some kind of particular terminology associated with a play, we have included an elaborative sentence. So our elaboration there is a chance to either explain the stylistic device that you wanted to refer to and give a little bit of context where this particular argument starts or how it's relevant to the overarching theme, or why this is relevant to the topic, or audience positioning. This is the most important thing in the development of argumentation. Each paragraph has 3 boxes there for evidence. Pattern of evidence, pattern of evidence. Remember back when we talked about what is involved in the process of analysis, one of the things was finding what's actually on the page and then seeing a pattern in what the evidence actually presents. And so what we're looking for is more than one example of what Macbeth does that's selfish, or more than one example of how violent actions are a reflection of a violent nature, or more than one example of the ways in which his unnatural actions then had a whole lot of unnatural consequences through the kingdom. So every paragraph has 3 bits of evidence. It doesn't have to be direct quotes, but if you're using a direct quote, then you're going to deconstruct that quote by explaining why it matters that Shakespeare used those words. The simplicity of our damn spot, the use of the word damn in that very brief little quote, the idea that because of actions by Macbeth, for example, even Lady Macbeth can no longer see herself as likely to go to heaven. She has been damned, and that what has damned her is her involvement in an unnatural deed. Okay, and as a result, it manifests in unnatural troubles for her, doesn't it? She's sleepwalking, she's confessing to sins, she's unable to rest, which is a much more natural thing. And then finally, in each paragraph, we have a warrant. So remember back when we were talking in the process of analysis, we looked at that idea of reasonableness. So you should be able to justify the reasonableness of the pattern that you've drawn, or the conclusion you've drawn in the final sentence of each paragraph. I would recommend that you use a cohesive tie like through. So through the evidence of characterization, then make reference to the author. Shakespeare positions the reader, or warns the reader, or demonstrates to the reader that as a result of selfish actions, Macbeth destroys his own family. So there's what we proved, we hope, in that paragraph. Okay, so cohesive tie showing that it's going to be in the text. Through the use of, and the name of the stylistic device, characterization of Macbeth, then the author, Shakespeare, verb, demonstrates, or positions the reader to see something. And that's a great way to write a warrant where you have to actually stand on the reasonableness of the conclusion you drew. And then you can see that the conclusion should span your entire essay, just the way that your thesis did at the beginning. Now, down the side here, we've included 3 boxes, and I strongly recommend these as part of your planning. We've included synonyms, which if you've unpacked something like unnatural, or if you unpacked something like disorder, those would be where you would write those words, because then you've got a whole lot of different ones to use. If you wanted to use a range of different words instead of positioned, that's where you put those. So demonstrated, warned, cautioned, those sorts of words could go there. Our terminology list are the ones associated, the stylistic devices associated with our text study. So characterization, setting, plot, rising action, falling action, symbolism, the stylistic devices of things like pathetic fallacy, dramatic irony. Those terms would be what goes in our terminology box. And then cohesive ties, of course, are all the ways that we want to actually connect our arguments together. It is so important, if you've had a look at your EAMG, that the marks that you get for cohesion don't just come from the way in which you organise your information into paragraphs, or the way in which you connect paragraphs together. It's actually the best way that you can build an argument within each paragraph is that you connect each sentence to the next one in some way. So they shouldn't just be bricks that are stacked on top of each other with no stability. The cohesive tie is that mortar that goes between them. So thinking about all the different ways that we can connect our sentences helps to actually strengthen the writing that we create. Okay, so remember there were two questions. One of them was our sample question from the 2020 paper. I know that not everybody is a graphic organizer. So I have also planned out an essay using dot points. So here I have 3 arguments for the ways in which the concept of disorder becomes significant or is significant in the play. And I've looked at Macbeth as an individual, Macbeth in relationships, so the idea that his particular behaviour destroys the trust he can form with other people. So not just Lady Macbeth, but also Banquo, also his king. And then I've looked at him specifically as a representation of authority. So Macbeth as ruler. And so in my dot pointing here, what I've had to try and do then is think about not just like a claim, which is what the dot points at the top are. That would be my claim. Macbeth as an individual is disordered in himself, and this leads to selfish actions. So, you know, this is me kind of saying that maybe as a result of the trauma of being a soldier, or maybe it's just something in himself, he is already internally disordered ambition that overleaps itself, and this makes him make selfish decisions. I then have unpacked the 3 kind of ideas from the text that I wanted to then explore. I've done the same in my second paragraph. I have my claim at the top: disorder in the form of mistrust destroys relationships. Well, that's true, we can prove that. And I've got 3 different ways that the relationships that Macbeth has are destroyed. So the idea that his reliance on Lady Macbeth is problematic, that she is fiend-like. I don't actually personally believe that, but I've used it for my argument here. And this leads to the murder of Duncan and Banquo. Now, I've put Banquo's murder first because I actually, in my argumentation, not because it's the first one that occurs, but it's actually the stronger point that I wanted to make. And finally, looking at him as a ruler. And of course, because we have other rulers in this story, other people who show symbols of rule, we actually have the opportunity to juxtapose them against each other. Okay, so then as a result of the work I did planning out my argumentation, I can actually refine my thesis down. So this is now my thesis 2.0 for the disorder essay. And you can see it's much longer. It actually almost is a paragraph in itself. What you will now have is evaluative language, very specifically chosen to manipulate my audience. I would have reference to values, attitudes, and beliefs. And I'm going to have evidence from within the play that actually positions my audience to see that I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so that's it for tutorial number 3. So now we pause and you go away and think about how you might brainstorm and plan your next essay response. Remember that you are not required to write 17 essays in preparation for the EA, but the more essays that the more questions you deconstruct and the more essays that you plan, the more confident you're going to feel about those really crucial developmental phases before you actually put pen to paper. So I look forward to seeing your planning develop. I look forward to reading a whole bunch of great responses. And if you would like to share them with me, I would happily give you some feedback, either written feedback in accordance with the EAMG, or verbal feedback, or feedback via email. But until then, see you later.